Welcome to Identity Matters, Digital Identity and the Evolution of the Internet, a special InnovationAus.com video podcast series brought to you by Ping Identity. From debating access to anonymity issues in online culture wars to fighting cyber threats on the commercial internet or in the delivery of government services, identity impacts everyone. In this series, we will speak to a compelling list of experts to trace the global online trends that have helped frame digital identity and to understand the cyber landscape shifts that have shaped identity access management practices and zero-trust environments. Join us as we explore the philosophical and practical sides of identity, the fundamental issue at the heart of the Internet.
Hello and welcome to Identity Matters, Digital Identity and the Evolution of the Internet, a podcast series produced by InnovationAus.com in partnership with Ping Identity. I'm James Riley, the editorial director at InnovationAus.com. Today I've got with me Steve Dillon, the head of the Asia Pacific Architecture at Ping Identity, and I've got Andrew Black, managing director at Connect ID. Welcome, gentlemen.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us, James.
Andrew Black, let me start with you. Just talk us through Connect ID. There's been a lot happening recently. I understand you guys have just gone live with a couple of very big customers. Where are you up to?
Yeah, absolutely, James. Exciting time for us. So for those who haven't come across Connect ID, we're a digital identity exchange. We sit as part of what's now called Australian Payments Plus. So that's an organisation that's brought together EFTPOS, BPay, and MPP. So it sort of effectively runs the domestic payment infrastructure for Australia. And Connect ID is sort of looking to do very similar, but in the digital identity ecosystem and economy. So our role is to be an exchange and also sort of a network provider and governance provider. And that effectively means we're a trust network at its core. So we allow Australians to use an identity they've already set up, already created, a trusted organisation such as a bank, and that announcement that we've recently made about Commonwealth Bank and National Australia Bank now being live and on the platform means those customers can use their bank to log in or verify or sign up to a new service, sort of removing that need really for them to take photos of passports or documents and sort of manually enter information going forward. So we act as that bridge.
So just before we go to Steve Dillon, I want to ask you, you've been working with the federal government on the TDIF, the Trusted Digital Identity Framework. All right, so just explain how, I mean, that process has taken some time to come to fruition. You've just gone live with this system with CommBank and the NAB. So are we at the end of that process?
We're at the end of the beginning, I guess. So from a TDIF point of view, sort of a couple of different distinctions. So the framework that the federal government set out sort of towards the end of 2016 has been in draft until that point. What it sort of sets out to do broadly, sort of place some rules around the whole digital economy and the interaction between public sector and private sector. So there's a few different areas within that, and one of those is being accredited. So being accredited under the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, which Connect ID is, and was the first digital identity exchange to do so from the private sector. And that helps set some sort of rules for the road, really, in terms of how private sector should engage with public sector services for identity and data. What it also, though, means is that when we get to this point now, which the Minister Gallagher has sort of advocated for in terms of actually legislating into next year, that'll help provide effectively the go for that interoperability. At the minute, there's government services, federal government services that are used across MyGov, the ATO, MyGov ID, for example. But this legislation will allow for that interoperability and allow effectively a private sector organisation like Connect ID to be that bridge from public to private. So as an individual, when you go to sign up for a new account somewhere, you could use your bank or you could use MyGov ID or potentially a state government service as well. So it's been a process of a lot of consultation over the past couple of years and ongoing consultation where we're continuously feeding back feedback to the Department of Finance and the Minister's office, but excited for the sort of next step next year.
All right, thank you. And Steve Dillon, I wonder, how does Ping Identity, is a very, very different organisation, just how do you fit into that, firstly, discussion about what the framework looks like, and now that there is the framework there, how does Ping plug into that?
Yeah, so Ping, not necessarily a household name because we are primarily a B2B business, but we are one of the largest providers of identity services and solutions on the planet. So we work with businesses around the world to ensure that they're implementing strong digital identity solutions that are both seamless in terms of the customer experience, but also as secure as they possibly can be. So we service those customers primarily. One of my roles at Ping locally in APAC is to ensure that we are doing a good job of aligning with region-specific initiatives. And so that's going to be things like Connect ID and helping our customers work within the Connect ID ecosystem, as well as things like consumer data.
So I'll just stay with you for a minute, Steve. If you can just talk to me a little bit about privacy and consent. I mean, these are huge issues for some people, so others not so much, I guess, but huge issue for some people. How, in digital ID, across different services using the same ID, how do you manage that? What does it look like? How does Ping do it?
Yeah, so we have our take on it, and then I suppose there's what Connect ID would do. Where we help specific companies with this is firstly by providing that secure identity layer, but then also giving them the ability to not just collect consents from their customers to share data. That's relatively straightforward. Where it gets complicated for a lot of particularly enterprises is in the ability to mediate that consent across legacy infrastructure, different org units, and all of those really complex IT and people problems. So we do have solutions that allow you to do fine-grained authorization, including consent management, across those broad ecosystems. In the context of something like Connect ID, we're really about helping companies connect into that ecosystem. And then Connect ID has some really interesting features that allow end users to control how they share that data and what it's used for.
So, Andrew Black, the Connect ID isn't just about private sector organisations kind of being connecting into, or retail consumers connecting into government services. It's also different private sector organisations being able to swap customers, if you like. I'm trying to think of a better way to term that. Is that the case?
So kind of close, yeah, James. We'll actually probably start in the latter. So actually today as we launch, we're sort of focused on private sector organizations. And what that sort of fundamentally means is that if you are a business who needs to onboard a new customer, it could be a business in some of our early sectors, such as rental. So the rental market being one, sort of looking at new tenants, or even from landlord's point of view, onboarding into new platforms. You'll no longer have to rely on maybe taking photocopies of driving license or passport, or even digitally uploading some of those. Your customers, if they enable Connect ID, will be able to use, for example, CommBank or NAB to verify who they are. And that list will extend. So we're starting with those two major partners, but we're supported by all four major banking partners. And we expect that to also extend across other private sector services. And really the sort of core for that is thinking about, well, the sort of why. So the overarching issue that we're trying to help solve is, how do you reduce the amount of data that's having to be shared? And that's sort of more and more timely as the breach count adds up, unfortunately, in Australia. But as those grow and as scams and sort of fraud grows as well, thinking about how do we reduce the amount of data that businesses need to gather and the customers need to share, and doing that in a far more customer-friendly way from an experience. So being able to do that with, for example, CommBank, You're able to log into the CommBank app, simply see the amount of information that's required from, say, the rental estate agent, have a transparent list of what that is, which would be less than today, and give express consent. So it's sort of 2-3 taps instead of fumbling around for documents, uploading things, and uploading that unnecessary amount of information. And what we mean by that unnecessary amount of information is, like, if you send your driving license, that proves there's an identity credential there. But what the rental estate agent doesn't need to know is, can I drive a scooter or a lorry, or all the other information that comes associated with that, which just isn't needed. So we'll start very much in that private sector to help businesses reduce that information they need to capture and help give customers more trust and more choice about where they do that. And then from next year and beyond, sort of span, hopefully, that sort of public-private interoperable network.
So this will drive this kind of famed tell us once kind of functionality, and bring with it the added benefit that you don't have to have personal information stored all over the internet. This is what we're getting at, right?
Exactly. And the way I sort of like to think about it is we're trying to transition away from what's been a set of processes that have been digitized. So typically you would, have gone into a branch and handed over a bit of paper or plastic. And now what we do is we typically take photos of paper and plastic. And that's a better experience. But actually we're moving us to a digital experience where it is digital. You've already set something up with a trusted provider, be it a bank or a state government, and you're able to reuse that. And that reusable, trusted digital identity means that as a customer, you can see where you've shared it. You've been involved in the consent of each one of those. There's no data being shared without your knowledge or your consent. You have full visibility of where and when and what. It gives kind of that customer centricity and control, whilst also absolutely sort of improving the journey and moving more to a set it up once and reuse model.
So, Steve, Dillon, it's quite a philosophical jump, isn't it, to enable that kind of someone else's credentials to get into your service? I guess I'd say specifically that's on, it's quite a jump for governments, right, to allow access to a government service for someone else's credential. Yes, it's all about trust, but works both ways. If I've got a MyGov ID, is the bank going to let me get into my account?
I honestly can't speak to the specifics of that. But as you say, it is very much all about trust. There is an accreditation scheme that goes into becoming part of TDIF, sorry. And so, it really is about extending the trust boundaries within, a network of proven entities. But really, as Andrew sort of alluded to, the goal here is to enable new digital experiences and effectively make people's lives better by not having to share the same data points over and over again, not having to overexpose data. We're only sharing the things that companies need to know, not all of the other bits that go with that. I do think it's an exciting time for the digital identity space in Australia.
Okay, so let me just before I go to you, Andrew, let me ask this new architecture and the ability to share credentials across these trusted networks. Would you, obviously startups in a big way are focused in this area? Are you expecting to see, that momentum, really take off in that software space?
Yeah, so potentially. I think one of the really great things that ConnectID have done is that they've made the barrier to entry for this as low as possible. So while you certainly can use products like Ping to help you integrate a full enterprise ecosystem into ConnectID, they do have some SDKs and developer tools as well that really allow, as you say, some of those smaller startup type operations to quickly integrate in. And as I sort of alluded to in my response to the last question, it is a very innovative space with some really good customer experience possibilities. And so I think the startups are in a good position to take advantage of that.
Andrew, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, probably with less of a developer hat on. That's Steve's expertise for sure. But thinking from a startup point of view, one of the bits of feedback we often get from businesses in the sort of small, medium sort of end of of sort of scale is actually where this will really help them, is reduce the amount of data they even have to capture. So those are the organizations who don't have the security forces of a ping or even of a CBA or a NAB, right? So helping them onboard and acquire new customers quickly with a good experience, with reducing the amount of data they have to capture, is good for their risk profile and risk appetite. So it's thinking about what we think the benefits for them will be, which will be enhanced products and services, but also just helping reduce that need and that sort of compliance overhead, which is a tough one to navigate for any new business.
So, I'm kind of fascinated by this, particularly the interaction with government. And Andrew, you haven't worked in the public service, but you've certainly done, been advising in that area. So, from a startup digital service delivery organisation who has to interact with a government organisation, if you're thinking in terms of, I don't know, it's the Department of Social Services or some kind of, NDIS or social services related activity, this could potentially act as a spur to a whole new way of delivering not third-party services, but services through private sector companies.
Absolutely. So this is where we see the benefits really across the digital economy. So there's a huge opportunity to enhance productivity by leveraging these types of new innovations, in particular reusable digital identity, and thinking about the benefits that brings to startups of lower overheads, lower onboarding costs, compliance costs, the ability to acquire customers quicker. That sort of applies across enterprise scale organizations as well. But where you have an interconnected sort of fabric of a digital economy, where this is where the core opportunity for Australia is to make sure we get this right, and thinking about global examples. So some that stand out that really sort of always sort of come to mind are in the Nordics. So thinking about things like Bank ID, where the average citizen, I think, uses that service over 200 times a year to log in or authenticate to different products and services across public and private sector. That gives a huge leg up to small businesses, startups, tech startups, or even traditional businesses as well, to reduce a kind of core element of what they're expected to do here. So the key for us is to get it right, and the key for us is to make sure that we have a hybrid and an interoperable network across public and private, and that's what Connect ID is here to do, to provide that bridge across private trust islands, but also into public sector in the future. But there's a huge opportunity, and the value, I think, even being sort of reported by McKinsey and in some of our reporting around sort of up to 3% of GDP for a developed economy such as Australia, to unlock some of that value, as well as, we're not even touching the surface of the epidemic of fraud and scams that have been on the rise, and try to provide some stronger trusted authenticated credentials behind that. But the opportunity is massive. So
just on that,
organizations.
Can I ask you, why is it so important that government is it's obviously a huge chunk of the economy, but why is it so important for it to be, to be active and live and, in sharing those credentials right now?
Well, I think it's really important, and it's the way it does it that's really important we get it right. So government already does this today, right? And if you think about in Service New South Wales, for example, you can check in or log into an RSL using a Service New South Wales app. MyGov ID is in use across different states and territories and agencies and government services. So it's already in place in some way, shape, or form. What's really important, though, for businesses is that they only have to go to one place to access all of these services. So the risk we run by not doing this, I'll say well or right, but interoperable, is as a small business, I have to decide, do I connect to a government service? Do I connect to a private service like Connect ID? Do I connect to another separate organization? It's the overhead of connecting to multiple different places is where we'll likely, if we don't get this right, sort of hit our demise. And then there won't be the uptake, there won't be the adoption, and we won't recognize the benefits. So I think, and it's credit TDIF is set up in this way so that it creates that set of rules and standards across the sort of public and private spheres. But that's the core opportunities to get this right, so that as a small business, I can integrate to someone like Connect ID, and my customers can choose to log in through MyGovID, through CommBank, through NAB, through Service New South Wales, for example. That's the core opportunity we really have in front of us, to make sure we make this easy for businesses.
Well, as someone who gets very frustrated with some of the security, who gets very frustrated with some of the things we have to do to access websites, I welcome this. But Steve, Dillon, I wonder, digital service delivery. We always talk about trying to make things friction free, or to reduce friction, to make things super easy. In terms of security, friction free doesn't always work. I sometimes on my phone, when I'm getting into one of my apps, I think, oh my God, that's terrifying. Like, how did I just do that so simply? So where does friction work in our favor in terms of access?
Yeah, so we do, one of the things we talk about is appropriate friction. So obviously we do want to reduce the amount of friction that end users see as much as possible. But there are times where you do want to introduce a bit of friction. And so, for example, let's say I'm about to transfer $10,000 because I'm buying a new car. If I'm just allowed to do that without any friction at all, without any barriers or roadblocks, that as an end user is going to make me feel not protected. It's going to make me feel nervous. And so in those scenarios, it actually is appropriate to use something like a transaction approval or an MFA prompt to give the user, firstly, I suppose I don't want to call it the appearance of security, but let them see the security. And then also use actual strong controls that go with something like a transaction approval. So you don't just ask a user to type in a PIN, right? You actually send them some context and say, hey, you're trying to transfer this money from here to here. Do you want to approve that? If so, take this action. There's also a lot of things we can do in the background as well. So let's say on, a more obscure example, if you're just logging in for a day-to-day transaction, we can be doing a lot of checks in the background. So we know for you, James, potentially what your logins look like. We know where you're logging in from, what time of day you usually log in from, what sort of machine you log in from, even down to like screen resolutions and things like that. And so we can build a really rich profile of what a user looks like. And whenever you see variations on that, then you can start to introduce friction as well. But even in that scenario, sometimes it's useful, even if you don't necessarily need a little spinning wheel. Sometimes you just want to pop it up anyway and just let people know that you're checking that stuff, just to make them feel a little bit better.
Oh my God, I'm never going to look at that spinning wheel in the same way again. All right, Andrew Black, I want to ask you about passkeys. Just to start winding this down, a large search engine company prompted me to set up a passkey recently. So just talk us through what's your view of implementing passkeys? How will it impact the way you guys manage the customer experience?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting trend, actually, and one that it's probably fairly indicative, and actually in a way is fairly similar to the way we've thought about Connect ID, right? So that sort of trend tells us that what do customers want? So they want other organizations to look after things for them, right? So passwords are painful and becoming more and more complex. So actually, what do we want to do? We want to outsource some of that to we can debate the level of trust of that third-party search engine, but to somebody else, right, effectively. And what else do they want to do? So they want to use maybe Touch ID or Face ID or a biometric to help unlock that rather than have to, again, type something in. So they want friction-free experiences. They want to be able to outsource some of that memory or headspace, as opposed to writing it down on a Post-it maybe at home. And actually, that's, again, largely the same feedback we get around identity. So whether it's a password or whether it's your identity or your data, you typically, as we've seen in quite a lot of our qualitative and quantitative data, you tend to trust banks. That's a sort of fairly common sort of scoring that comes out. Or certainly trust your bank to look after it. They already look after your money. So being able to look after your data or your identity. And the way we developed the solution is to think with that sort of very sort of similar customer experience in mind. So when you're sharing it, we don't ask you to put in anything new. You log into your bank in the same way you would today. So it's often a Face ID on a phone or a Touch ID or some form of passcode, but it's something you're familiar with as an authentication experience, and then consent to sharing it. So I think it's part of that broader trend that we're asking and demanding more and more from individuals to come up with more creative and more complex passwords rather than sort of just childhood pets. But actually the challenge of doing that then often means that individuals are looking for others to help them. And I think that's where that sort of trends across identity and across data.
Yeah, 100%. Steve, Dillon, I wonder if you want to talk on that. It's Ping. Have you seen Ping customers implementing passkeys? How's that going?
Yeah, so passkeys, really, it started to gain steam about a year ago when Apple announced it at their Worldwide Developer Conference. So it's something that a lot of customers are in the early stages of looking into, whether it's still, I suppose, doing feasibility studies on it, or whether they're actually in the early stages of implementing. There's not too many companies globally that have gone fully into passkeys, certain search engines, for example. But we certainly are in the early stages of those deployments. I think one of the things to look out for with deploying passkeys is, because it is still quite new and because the standards are still evolving, what you're going to see is, firstly, there needs to be a little bit of a user adoption cycle to get them used to it. And that's going to be led by the search engines and those sorts of companies. But also there's varying degrees of browser support. So passkeys is very heavily dependent upon support from the major browsers. And the level of that support, depending on which browser you're using, does vary. So yeah, I think at the moment it's very much an opt-in, advanced user type of a capability that you want to enable. But over the next 1 to 5 years, we should see it hitting the mainstream and becoming much, much more common.
All right, you've been listening to Identity Matters, Digital Identity and the Evolution of the Internet, brought to you by innovationoz.com and Ping Identity. Just to wrap up, I guess I'm going to give both of you a quick opportunity to talk about what happens in the next 12 months. What do you hope to happen, but what you expect actually will happen in the digital ID space? Andrew Black, you must be very excited. You're really up and running now, but what do 12 months look like?
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be asked it. So as we've just launched, there'll be a couple of things we're expected to see in the next sort of 12 to 24 months, really, which looks at users starting to use Connect ID. They'll start seeing it across websites, across journeys, potentially in store. So keep your eyes peeled for it, and starting to use Commonwealth Bank and NAB as sort of trusted identity providers. And then beyond that, we'll be expanding that sort of set of coverage with other banks, with other providers. So really that next 12 months is exciting. We're able to put it in front of Australians and start to hopefully see a real trend towards reducing the amount of data that has to be shared.
And Steve, Dillon?
Yeah, look, I'd have to, I think, echo Andrew's comments. I think Connect ID is probably the most interesting thing that's happening in the identity space in Australia at the moment. And then you, obviously, James, you've already mentioned passkeys. So I think globally speaking, that's probably the most interesting trend for the next 12 months.
All right, Steve Dillon, Head of Asia Pacific Architecture at Ping Identity, and Andrew Black, Managing Director at Connect ID. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Identity Matters, Digital Identity and the Evolution of the Internet video podcast series, brought to you by Ping Identity. For more, keep tuning in to innovationoz.com/podcasts or visit pingidentity.com.